The air in the courtroom is always thick. It's a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief, anger, anticipation. But on this day, the silence was different. It was sharp. It was a razor's edge. A young man, barely old enough to vote, stood before the judge. He was accused of a crime so brutal it had shaken his community to its core. His face was a blank canvas, betraying nothing. Not fear, not remorse. Just an unnerving, hollow emptiness. The families sat huddled together, their knuckles white as they gripped each other's hands. They were waiting for justice. They were waiting for a word that could somehow close a wound that would never truly heal. The judge began to speak. The words were methodical, deliberate, each one landing like a hammer blow. He recounted the details of the crime. He spoke of the life that was stolen. He spoke of the future that was erased. The teenager, a boy named Daniel, just stared ahead. It was as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. His own mother was weeping silently in the back row, her shoulders shaking with sobs she dared not let escape. The victim's family watched him, their eyes burning with a question that had no answer. Why? How could a child do this? Then came the final words, the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. When we hear the stories, it's easy to see only the crime. The headlines scream teen killer, and we paint a picture in our minds. A monster. A cold, calculating predator devoid of humanity. But the reality is often far more complex and in some ways more disturbing. Take the case of Alyssa Bustamante. At 15 she was a high school sophomore in Missouri. On the surface she was just another teenager navigating adolescence. She had friends, she posted on social media. But beneath that veneer was a dark world of depression and self-harm. A silent scream for help that went unanswered until it was too late. Then there was Eric Smith. In 1993 he was just 13 years old. A small, freckle-faced boy with glasses who was relentlessly bullied at school. He was an outcast. He was isolated, simmering with a rage he didn't know how to process. That rage eventually exploded in a horrifying act of violence against a 4-year-old boy in his neighborhood. He wasn't a hardened criminal mastermind. He was a deeply troubled child, a victim of abuse and neglect himself, who then turned his pain outward in the most destructive way imaginable. Stepping into a courtroom during the sentencing of a teenager is like entering a vacuum. All the noise of the outside world disappears, replaced by a dense, palpable tension. The room is often divided, a physical representation of the chasm of grief that separates two families. On one side sits the victim's family, their faces etched with a sorrow that time has not softened. They sit upright, their posture rigid, as if bracing for another blow. They are there to bear witness to ensure their loved one is not forgotten. On the other side, you find the defendant's family. Their pain is different shame confusion, a fierce protective love for the child they are about to lose. They often avoid eye contact, their gazes fixed on the floor, the back of their child's head. You can see parents who look aged beyond their years, their faces hollowed out by sleepless nights and unending worry. They are mourning a loss too. That will seal a young person's fate and define the rest of their days. There is no sound quite like the one that follows a life sentence. It is a moment where time itself seems to fracture. For some teenage killers, the reaction is immediate and explosive. The carefully constructed wall of detachment they've maintained throughout the trial crumbles into dust. We saw it with a young man in Ohio, convicted of a fatal shooting. As the judge uttered the words "life without parole," his face, which had been a mask of indifference, contorted in disbelief. A low moan escaped his lips. It quickly escalated into a full-throated wail. He lunged toward his family, his arms outstretched. He was restrained by deputies. It was the raw, desperate cry of a boy realizing the gate had just slammed shut forever. In other cases, the reaction is the complete opposite: chilling emptiness. Consider the case of a 17-year-old convicted in a gang-related murder. He stood perfectly still as his sentence was read. He did not flinch, he did not cry, his expression remained flat, almost bored. As he was led from the courtroom, he glanced at the victim's weeping family and smirked. That small, almost imperceptible gesture was an act of final, defiant cruelty. It communicated a terrifying lack of remorse. For the grieving family, that smirk was a second assault. Then there is the collapse. Before a sentence is handed down, the court must listen. It must hear the voices of those who have been shattered by the crime. This is the time for victim impact statements. They are often the most gut-wrenching moments of any trial. A mother stands at the podium, hands trembling as she unfolds a piece of paper. She tries to speak, her voice catches. She takes a breath, she begins to describe her son. Not the victim on the report, but her boy. His laugh, his love for baseball, the way he used to hug her. She speaks of the holidays that are now empty, the milestones that will never be reached. She looks at the teenager in the defendant's chair and asks, "Do you know what you took from us?" Her words are not just for the judge, they confront the person who inflicted this pain. She describes the night she got the call, the unending nightmare her life has become. She speaks of visiting a cemetery instead of a college campus. Through her tears, she gives a voice to the voiceless, ensuring the court sees the crime as the annihilation of a world. Her statement is a monument of grief, built word by word in the silent courtroom. The pain is not confined to one side of the aisle. The family of the teenage defendant is also living a nightmare. The question that haunts every one of these cases is a simple yet profound one. Why? Why does a teenager with their whole life ahead of them commit murder? There is no single answer. Instead, it is almost always a toxic combination of factors, a perfect storm that culminates in a violent outburst. One of the most common threads is the environment. Many of these young offenders grow up surrounded by chaos and violence. They are raised in homes where abuse is common, where neglect is the norm, where substance abuse is part of daily life. They learn from a young age that violence is a way to solve problems, to gain respect, or to exert control. Their moral compass is broken before it ever has a chance to form properly. Mental health is another critical piece of the puzzle. The adolescent brain is a work in progress. The prefrontal cortex governs impulse control, decision-making, and understanding consequences. It is not fully developed until the mid-20s. Combine that immaturity with undiagnosed or untreated mental illnesses like depression, bipolar disorder, or psychosis. The results can be catastrophic. When a judge says life in prison, what does that truly mean for a 16-year-old? It's not an abstract concept. It is a concrete reality. It begins the moment they are transferred from a juvenile facility to an adult maximum security prison. They walk into a world designed for hardened adult criminals. They are surrounded by men who are older. They are surrounded by men who are stronger. They are surrounded by men who are more institutionalized. The teenager may still be physically and emotionally immature. They are suddenly forced to navigate a brutal and unforgiving environment. Survival depends on a completely different set of rules. They are no longer a child in the eyes of the state. They are an inmate and a target. The loss of a future is absolute. A life sentence for a teenager erases every milestone we associate with growing up. There will be no high school graduation, no prom, no first car, no college, no career, no falling in love and starting a family. Their world shrinks to the size of a prison cell, a concrete yard, a visitation room. Their life becomes a monotonous, unending routine governed by bells, head counts, and the constant threat of violence. Years and sometimes decades after the sentencing, the question of remorse becomes central. Has the teenage killer, now an adult inmate, changed? In some cases, the transformation is profound and genuine. Locked away from the destructive environment and influences that shaped their youth, they are forced to confront the reality of what they did. They participate in educational programs, they participate in therapy, they participate in religious services, they read, they write, they reflect. The boy who was once defiant, the boy who was once angry slowly becomes a man who is quiet, thoughtful, and consumed by guilt. However, this is not always the case. For others, the mask of indifference they wore in the courtroom never comes off. Prison does not rehabilitate them, it hardens them. They embrace the culture of the penitentiary, adopting its codes of violence and defiance. They show no remorse because they feel none, or in an empty, echoing void.